Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut Global Security Forum 2020. Each year, we explore the world's most critical security issues that impact our nation and our world. And this year, we're virtual, allowing even more people from around the world to join us, including World Affairs Councils from across the country. So thank you everyone for joining in. I am Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our noon session, The Kill Chain with Chris Brose. I'm so excited for this panel. I've been excited since Chris confirmed that he would be with us. I heard him at a talk at the Aspen Security Forum, and I said we have to have him. His book, The Kill Chain, is something that anyone and everyone who's concerned with national security, with securing our future and equipping our troops and force readiness has to read. It's fascinating. I enjoyed it. I have it both in hard copy and in audio. So I really recommend that you check it out. There'll be a link to purchase the book in the chat. So the format today will be an interactive discussion between Lieutenant General Mike Moeller, who's the Vice President of our board, and Chris Brose. Chris was the Staff Director of the Senate Armed Services Committee, worked on the staff of Senator John McCain, and is currently working on the very issues that we're going to talk about today. So without any further ado, Lieutenant General Mueller, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thanks, Megan, very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with Global Security Forum in the virtual environment. And Chris, thanks again for taking time out of your schedule to talk with the Security Forum community. We really appreciate your spending the time with us.
No, thanks for having me. Honored to be here.
As you know, as someone who spent over 3 decades in the national defense arena, as I read your book, I took it as a urgent call to arms for transformational changes across the national security enterprise, not just with the Department of Defense, but across the entire enterprise on how we gain and maintain our superiority over potential and future adversaries. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. If you're ready, let's dive right in.
Absolutely.
You know, speaking about diving right in, as you start at the very beginning of the Kill Chain, it outlines the scenario between the United States and China, and the U.S. finds itself to compete to win. Can you tell us about the urgent state of the threat, especially with China?
Yeah. So what I would say at the outset, you know, and what I try to make clear in the book is, you know, when we talk about sort of strategic competition, the United States versus China, there's obviously a lot of elements to that competition, right? I mean, there's economics, there's statecraft, diplomacy, values, information, but there is absolutely the hard security kind of military competition between the two states. And that's really what I'm focused on in the book. All those other things are really important. The thing that I'm really kind of narrowly focused on is the military competition. And, you know, my concern here is, you know, in terms of how you look at the matchup, you know, the Chinese Communist Party has been making investments, military investments, to modernize its forces now, going back to a campaign for them that began really after the end of the first Gulf War, so the early 1990s. And they haven't sought to play the same game as the United States. They've sought to play a different game. They've sought to put in place military capabilities that are fundamentally and explicitly designed at calling into question and undermining the ways and means through which the United States has traditionally projected military power. And, you know, the specific systems that they have invested in to do that, you know, have to do with really targeting kind of the frameworks and foundations of U.S. military power in terms of our, you know, forward bases in the region, our carriers and sort of sea bases, you know, the strike aircraft that we would use to sort of project power. And, you know, they have made a lot more progress than I think most Americans realize. They've made a lot more progress than I think many members of Congress realized. And this was a frustration of mine and something that I spent a lot of my time on working for Senator McCain in the Armed Services Committee, of just trying to inform people about the state of this challenge. But the thing I would say, just kind of the bottom line here, is this has not been like an earthquake, you know, or a hurricane that sort of hit us one day without warning. This has been a methodical effort that the Chinese Communist Party has been embarked upon for the better part of 3 decades. And they have systematically made progress year after year after year at a pretty rapid and alarming rate. And I think where we find ourselves now is, to be clear, the Chinese are not 10 feet tall, but they are, 6'8" and growing rapidly. And I think that's the thing that we need to take account of, is that the trajectory that this competition is on from a military standpoint is very bad for us. Our military technological advantage is eroding, and if you talk to a lot of people in the defense world, they may even say that it has eroded. In certain areas, we have been surpassed. And I think this is a difficult thing for Americans to comprehend, because we have become almost, I would argue, complacent about the military dominance that we've enjoyed really since the end of the Cold War. And that, I think, is the root of our problem, is that we have struggled to imagine a world where a peer competitor could catch up to us and pass us in the construction and exercise of military power in a very, what will be a very long-term military competition. So to me, the sense of urgency is that we are rapidly being caught. We are on the path to being surpassed. And if that happens, not in 2 decades, but in the near future, I think is what we're talking about here in terms of timelines, we will begin living in a world that is very unfamiliar to us, very different than the one that we have come to take for granted and enjoyed for a very long time. And that world is not going to be better for us. And I think that is, to me, the real kind of sense of urgency that I wanted to get across in the book, which is we are at risk of losing something very precious to us, not in the long term, but in the very near future.
Thanks, Chris. And it definitely comes out in the book. If I could follow on with that thread, then if in fact the Department of Defense, the defense enterprise is unprepared for the high-tech 21st century warfare, can you just describe or discuss what is required? What's the transformation that has to happen in defense if we are in fact going to either stop the trajectory and maintain our competitive edge?
So, it's a great question, and there's lots of pieces to this. And, one thing that was really striking to me as I went back and sort of read and reread a lot of the things that we have been saying as a defense establishment now for the better part of 3 decades. I mean, things that you lived, were a part of, helped to generate in your time in uniform and in the Department of Defense. What was striking to me is how similar it all is. We've been saying so many of the same things for so long, and we have been consistently coming up short and failing to do so many of the things that we say are necessary. And you can point to a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, you can point to the sort of requirements process for how we determine what military systems are going to be important for us in the future. You can talk about the acquisition system and all of the ways that it continues to be broken. You can certainly talk about, spending and money and shortfalls and increases and uncertainty about funding. But ultimately, to me, the thing that is going to have to change, and I think the reason that we have not changed as much as we have needed to in recent decades, comes down to the basic belief that change is less bad than the alternative. We have to be able to contemplate that there is something worse than change. And I think that's the thing that we have failed to do in recent years. We've talked a lot about the need to change, but we haven't actually believed that it was essential. We've believed it would be a nice thing to do, it would be a good thing to do, eventually we should get around to it. But there wasn't, I think, a visceral sense and belief among our leadership, and I appreciate that you use the word defense enterprise. That's the thing I try to stress in the book, is that this is the Department of Defense, civilian and military. It's the Congress, both houses, both parties. It's defense industry. It is an ecosystem. And I do not believe that for recent years and decades, that group of Americans has believed that if we fail to change, there will be catastrophic consequences to it. And I think that is now starting to settle in. There's more of a recognition that we are in a position of potentially being surpassed here, not in the distant future, but in the near future. And to me, we can monkey around with and change, the requirements process and the acquisition process. And, heavens knows that I wrote hundreds of pages of legislation while I was in the Congress trying to do all of these things. But at the most basic level, this has been a failure of imagination. We need to think differently, and we need to understand that change is not optional. Change is existential.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to pull that thread again a little to make it more specific and talk specifically about the defense acquisition, which one of the things that I took away from the book that I found very insightful is that the department and the Congress, the enterprise, focuses on acquiring specific things, platforms, rather than focus on acquisition of the capabilities required for this 21st century warfare. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So my frustration in the time that I spent in government working this for a decade or more is that we have a system that is fundamentally geared toward buying inputs rather than buying outcomes. We fixate on defining requirements, building programs, and budgeting for platforms, like you said. And by platform, what we mean by that are aircraft, ships, vehicles, the trucks that take people and sensors and weapons into the places that we need them to compete militarily. And we do that for understandable reasons. They look good in parades. You can employ people to build them. It's very easy and sort of concrete to imagine what we're talking about here when you sort of speak about platforms. But the reality is that those platforms are simply inputs and tools, whereas the more important thing that militaries are actually seeking to do, what actually gives them military advantage over competitors, is this process that the United States military refers to as the kill chain. And at a sort of a basic level, that is a process of understanding, decision-making, and action. And you have to do all of these things. You don't get to do 2 out of 3. You have to do this sequentially. It's not a very good idea to try to make decisions and take actions in the absence of generating understanding about what's happening on the battlefield or wherever it is that militaries are competing. So we don't have a system that's actually geared toward defining requirements for and spending money on the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And a lot of this, I think, to go back to to our last conversation, is around, we have become so enamored of the platforms that we've been using for so long, decades in most cases, that we can't imagine a world where that is not the source of our military advantage. So we focus on how to incrementally improve the large ships and large aircraft and other systems that we've operated for a very long time, rather than saying, what I'm actually trying to do is generate understanding, make decisions, and take actions faster, better, at greater and greater scales than my competitors. This is ultimately a cognitive competition. How am I going to essentially move through that process better and faster than my competitors can keep up? And the question of what tools, what technologies I'm using to do that, to me, is of secondary importance. But we don't put it into that sort of framework and sort of relief, which makes it very difficult to actually value the things that are going to deliver us faster kill chains at greater scale, as opposed to just better versions of old things. And that's what we have been largely investing in for the past few decades. And that's, I think, the source of much of our problem to date.
So Chris, and one of the things that I also took away is that there's no checklist that we can go down that say, if we acquire these capabilities, we will in fact actually begin to catch up. And so I ask this question from your perspective, in that what are the 2 or 3, I don't want to say things, the 2 or 3 critical changes that the department has to make, that the enterprise has to make, in order to, again, to stop that upward trajectory or the decline of U.S. defense superiority?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I mean, I'd answer it a little bit differently. I mean, aside from that sort of shifted mindset that we have to change and it's not optional, the answer that I'd give you is we need to be a lot humbler about what we think the future is going to look like, because we've been militarily dominant for so long. We've been so many laps ahead of the competition. It's led us to a way of building military systems that is based on a belief that we can predict the future, out to 2030, 2035, that we can define requirements for specific military technologies and capabilities that we're going to want to build and field by, a decade from now. And this belief that, because we were so far ahead, that if it took us that long to get there, we would still be able to deliver advantage, and we would end up farther ahead. The thing that I think we need to wrestle with now is that we don't know what the threat, how it's going to progress. We don't know what the future operating environment is specifically going to look like. We don't know what technologies are going to be invented between now and 3 years from now that are going to, give us advantage and overmatch. And we don't know how we're going to want to operate any of these things, from the standpoint of, what operational concepts are going to be more relevant in terms of, generating advantage with the tools that we have. And we need to actually build a process that allows us to experiment our way into that future in a period of, geopolitical and technological uncertainty, rather than trying to micromanage what we think the future is going to look like on timelines that we're not going to be able to predict. I joke a lot that, if I had to use the Department of Defense requirements process, 10 years ago for the development of my phone, I would have the best flip phone in America, but I would not have the iPhone 10. This is the problem, is that, we've got to get out of this hubristic belief that, we can control, the pace of technology, the pace of the threat, the pace of events, and put in place processes that allow us to buy the best things that are available right now, get them into the hands of military operators so that they can generate ideas for what they want to do with them, how they're going to operate differently, how they're going to solve problems differently, and what they would like to see in terms of future technological development, and allow that process to play out iteratively year after year after year, rather than the way we have been doing this for the past few decades. So it's a bit of a different answer to the question. There are lots of specific technologies that I think we can focus on, from artificial intelligence to autonomous systems. But I think the more interesting question is, how are we actually going to adapt when we inevitably get things wrong? Are we going to have a system that enables us to do that quickly, respond quickly, take advantage of opportunities as they emerge quickly? And that's something that we've largely failed to do, and I would argue are still failing to do.
And I would agree, Chris. It is disappointing when I look back to the mid '90s, and I was working in the Joint Staff for Admiral Owens and at the time, and as the primary author for the first military Joint Vision 2010. I watched as this tension played out across the department between the Revolution and Military Affairs group and the make iterative improvements, but keep doing what we're doing, from the operational concepts, from the procurement, and from the training and development, professional development that the team worked. It was a fascinating lesson in leadership, which ultimately 9/11 essentially changed that vector away from at least the very beginnings of a transformation. One of the things that I did see is that a leader can make change, or begin to make change. And you talked about some of those leaders, historic leaders like Admiral Moffett, General Schriever, who were instrumental in making a difference when it came to a shift. It may not have been transformational, but it was certainly a shift in how we think and act and conduct our military operations. Today, do you see that any of those transformational leaders, again, across the enterprise, in the Congress, in the department, and in industry, and/or in industry?
I do. I mean, I work with them on a daily basis today, and they're not all, you know, their first names are not always General and Admiral, as you can appreciate. And the thing what I'd like to say, before I go on, and it goes off of what you just said about 9/11. Of course we, for much of the past 2 decades, have been, very focused on, fighting counterterrorism operations overseas. This was something we had to do. To the extent that we overdid it is a topic of debate. A lot of mistakes obviously being made there. But the other thing to underscore here is these are incredibly hard problems. And the people who are working on them, and this goes to your question, are hardworking, patriotic, public-spirited, creative people, both in government and outside of it. And they have a very difficult challenge here of ultimately trying to predict where a very dynamic competitor is going to go, and make very large bets on how the future is going to turn out. That is an unfortunately difficult problem. And I think that goes to the question of, how do we put in place a process that recognizes more realistically the difficulties there, and really kind of grades ourselves on more of our ability to adapt. So, the question, I guess, or how I would respond to your question is, there are absolutely people in the Department of Defense, in the enterprise, who, are the General Shrevers and the Admiral Moffats of today. I think the thing that we did so well many decades ago with leaders like that was that we bet big on them. We gave them a bounded problem to solve. Transform the carrier into a warfighting system. Transform, the development of technology to deliver an intercontinental ballistic missile that can deliver a nuclear warhead to the other side of the planet in a matter of minutes. Very specific strategic and operational problems that had to be solved. And we empowered those individuals with resources, with sort of the nation behind them, to make transformational change, but not to make transformational change in one foul swoop, but to do it experimentally, incrementally, year over year over year, learning and failing. And when they did fail, when General Shriver blew up, test bodies and rocket engines and prototypes on the launch pad down at Cape Canaveral, he wasn't sort of summarily executed. He was given support to learn and make the next improvement to get where you need to go. Those are the kinds of processes that I would like to see us put in place to actually determine who those leaders are, and enable them to rise to the fore. And then when we do find them, to bet on them, to actually bet on them to deliver the types of capabilities and operational concepts and new organizations that we're going to need to be successful in the future.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. And it is interesting because in the past, those senior leaders were empowered, and they could fail as they worked towards ultimate success in their areas. I don't see that environment right now for senior leaders at any level, as well as for our as well as for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen that are in the field. That the concept of providing them with technologies and then step back and watch what they'll do with it is completely foreign, I still believe, in the department. Is there a mechanism that we can at least look to that would change that culture, so that in fact actually we could build that lasting positive change and set us back on the right trajectory?
Yeah, so I go back to what are the kinds of processes that I believe will sort of help us through what is going to be a very long period of competition and technological change. And the thing that I think more than ever that we need is to open up more of these programs that we're putting large amounts of money into, to real competition. We talk about competition, but there's not enough of the right competition in the defense world. It's become a very consolidated, very closed, very opaque system where, you know, in industry after industry around the country, right, from financial technology to biotechnology to consumer electronics and social media, you've seen the emergence of new technology, new companies, new founders who have been able to disrupt old ways of doing things and deliver, you know, significantly improved, you know, services, goods, new, you know, approaches to problems. That has not happened in the defense world. It has become impervious to disruption. And I think one of the things that would be most helpful is to stop trying to buy everything the same way. There are going to be large capital intensive programs like an aircraft carrier or a submarine, a long range bomber, that there's only going to be but so many companies in America that can build something like that. And they're going to operate on very long timelines. But I would argue that that's actually the minority of what we're really going to need to be investing in for the future. The preponderance is going to be, I think, a lot of these newer technologies around, you know, unmanned systems, autonomous systems, you know, command and control systems, software that can be bought much more regularly. That the department can begin to create incentives for new entrants to come in, have an ability to actually compete for a program in the real world based on performance, based on what we're actually trying to achieve from the standpoint of our outcomes. And if they can outperform what is currently the incumbent program, the best in breed capability, they have an opportunity to walk away with a large contract. And those are the kinds of incentives that will begin drawing top talent, engineering talent, investment back into the defense sector, where it's largely left over the past 3 decades through this consolidation period, and begin changing the incentives so that we have a more dynamic industrial base, more competition, more vendors who are actually capable of scaling up to be real contributors to these military technologies that are going to be important for us in the future. But do this on a more regular basis so that defense is never going to be like the commercial world. It is just inherently different, but it doesn't need to be as different as it's become. And I think finding ways where we can open up more of this to the ways that things get better in our day-to-day lives, you know, openness, more choice, more real competition, you know, more ability for the end user, which in the Department of Defense is the actual soldier, sailor, or airman, marine, the war fighter at the edge, to have a choice to get a better system. And know that every single year, you know, there's going to be this opportunity to bring new things in, rather than the way we thought about military programs is like tenure at a university. Like once you get awarded a military program of record, it's yours for forever. And very rarely is it recompeted, or, you know, do you have the opportunity to lose it? And it takes all of the incentive for performance out, all of the incentive for improvement out. So how do you create these avenues for disruption? To me, that is the most important thing. And it gets down to thinking about the process differently, which is eminently doable. The Department of Defense can do this inside of the laws and policies that it has today. And they have plenty of money to do it. I think the question is just imagining a different way of going about it, and trying to think about the process of change differently than we have before.
I've got one last question, Chris. As I looked across for examples of what you just talked about, does the reusable space launch program, where SpaceX essentially gained entree into the space business, does it give you hope? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
I mean, it is, but you've got to go back and sort of look at the full story, right? I mean, the irony of that is you had an incumbent contractor who had a perfect launch record, and no one can take that away from them. But they were expensive, and they were the only game in town. And SpaceX, you know, developed a capability that didn't exist, that the Department of Defense did not have a requirement for, but they basically said, look, rather than throwing away the rocket every time we go to space, which is like throwing away the airplane every time we fly across the country, what if we could reuse it? And, you know, they developed this capability, and they wanted an opportunity to compete for space launch dollars and programs. And basically the response what you would have thought the response would be, right, from the Department of Defense, the Air Force, the Congress, was fantastic, competitive pressure, an opportunity to solve a problem totally differently. And it was completely the opposite. You know, the sort of the doors were shut, people manned the ramparts, there was a desire to sort of limit the ability of SpaceX to compete in this regard. And they had to fight their way in every single step of the way. And I lived a lot of this when I was in the Senate. And it ultimately got to the point where SpaceX had to sue the government to even get a fair hearing. And they won that lawsuit. And now they're in the position that you described today. But the right way to think about this is, if you're a startup company, if you're an investor, if you're an engineer, and you're thinking about what to do with your future, with your money, with your company, why on earth would you want to do work with the Department of Defense and Washington, D.C.? Why would you pick defense as the area that you want to focus on, when that's the one success story, right? I mean, that's the other thing about this, is that SpaceX, I can maybe count to 2 or 3 companies like this who have tried to come in, have broken in successfully, and have achieved success at scale. Why would anybody want to emulate that when you're looking at a long drawn out process, multi-year, ending in lawsuits, to even get a fair hearing? And I would argue that the reason they were able to do that largely has to do with the fact that they were founded by a billionaire who had the wherewithal and sort of the will and the money to go through that multi-year, kind of crawl through glass to ultimately get to the process or the place that they're in today. So again, this is about incentives to me. And if those are what we're creating by way of incentives, then you're not going to have the next 10, the next 100, great companies line up to say, I want to get in on that game. So these are the things that need to change at the level of incentives to attract that talent, those companies, those engineers and investors back into the defense world.
Thank you, Chris, very much. I know there are a number of questions out there. One of them is interesting, and I know you've spent quite a bit of time talking about lawfare and the ethical considerations, and the book does spend time talking about that. The question is, what are the ethical considerations countries should be making? And I will turn that a little bit to include China when introducing new technologies into warfare, especially with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's a great question, and to me, it is the central question. These new technologies that we're developing right now are remarkable, but they are still in their infancy. They have a lot of work to do. There's a lot that they can do, but there's a lot that they cannot and should not do right now. And this is going to be a process of development and a process of human beings learning to trust what these much more intelligent, much more autonomous capabilities are going to enable them to do. At the center of this has to be the human being. And the ethical questions, particularly when you're talking about matters of use of violence, life and death, real world consequences as there are in the military domain. And I think the greatest concern that I have when I look at what China is doing is they're not operating in the same ethical paradigm as we are. They are using these technologies for the oppression of minority rights, for social control, for creating a surveillance state like the world has never seen. And exporting these technologies to other authoritarian governments that are eager to get their hands on them to replicate this model of sort of techno dictatorship in their own countries. That to me is what we need to be kind of focused on when we think about this competition and this technological competition, is that at the root of it, the stakes are so high because ultimately this is an ethical competition. It's a competition of values and worldviews. And the sort of worldview that the Chinese Communist Party is bringing to this is not the same as the one that the United States government is bringing. For all of our faults, for all of the mistakes that we have made, are making, and will make, they're being made inside of a framework that is fundamentally different than the one that is sort of guiding decision makers in Beijing. I think that's something that we need to recognize. And I think it needs to add to that sense of urgency from the standpoint of believing that we are not going to talk them into better behavior. We're not going to sort of influence norms and values around these technologies through rhetoric alone. We are going to have to do it by building these technologies, engineering our values into them, and doing it transparently. Being very clear and open about the capabilities and limitations of these technologies, what they should be allowed to do and what they should not be allowed to do, to put the onus back on our competitors to say, are you doing the same? And what are you doing, to hold yourself to an ethical standard that you should? We are not going to lead the world in these technologies if we fall behind in the building of them. The norms and values are going to be defined by the builders of these technologies. So to me, it adds a sense of urgency to, we have got to move out and build these technologies so that we can shape how they're going to be used in the future, not just by our own citizens, but by people across the world.
Thanks, Chris. The next question is about working with allies and other countries to develop either the rules and regulations or essentially establishing these alliances that can stop, limit, slow down that Chinese trajectory by working together?
It's a great question, and one of the greatest sources of strength that the United States has are our allies, our partners, our friends, and how many countries around the world want to work with us. Despite all of the friction of the past 3.5 years, the reality is we still have more friends in the world and more people who want to count themselves as friends of America than our competitors do, and that is to our advantage. So first and foremost, we need to sort of get out of the path that we've been on here for the better part of 4 years, where we seem to be picking the largest fights with our closest friends, and we need to focus on how what brings us together for all the differences we may have and frustrations we may have with our allies and they have with us. We've got to recognize that ultimately we are in this together, and we have to multiply our power, our influence. What we are doing, we have to coordinate from the standpoint of technology development. We need to think of each other as parts of our own sort of common innovation base, so that the movement of people and talent and technology can kind of flow back and forth in a much freer way than it has to date. Because ultimately this is about kind of multiplying the power and influence of democratic countries that share liberal values and want to see these technologies like artificial intelligence governed in a framework of liberal values in the future. And we have to do that together, not apart. So I 100% agree with the question that this is central, and we need to do a heck of a lot better job of it in the years to come, and I hope we will.
Thank you, Chris. I agree. The power of the alliance, this extended family working together, is critical. The second part of the question was, are other countries, are our allies not feeling that sense of urgency as well, just as the United States is not?
It's a good question, and I'm reluctant to speak for them, but I don't see. I do not see the kind of sense of urgency, across our alliances that we need. I mean, we all seem very distracted by the things going on at home, the parochial fights that we're kind of engaged in here, and I guess that's the way to sort of the way I would answer the question is that if we did have a sense of urgency, I would argue we would not be doing a lot of things that we are doing, and we would be doing a lot of things differently that we're not doing. It's hard to imagine that we have the right sense of urgency to focus on the priorities that we're discussing here and really get after them with urgency and tenacity. When you watch the debate that we had earlier this week, when we watch the fights that we're picking with our allies over things that are important, but I would argue are of secondary importance to the race we're running and the competition that we're involved in here with, with our competitors worldwide. So that to me is the frustrating thing, is just, I have a hard time believing, despite what people say, that there really is a sense of urgency when I see so many things that are taking place, that are playing out, that just appear to be empirical evidence to the contrary.
Well, this has gone so fast, Chris. I can't believe that we've got less than 5 minutes left. So rather than asking another question, I want to turn it over to you for final comments, overview, or a summary of your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity, and I guess what I would say is, I can come off at times as somewhat pessimistic. I'd like to think that I'm more realistic, kind of trying to look at the problem for what it is and really call balls and strikes here. At the end of the day, I am an optimist, and I do want that to come across, that when I look at America today, I see a country that at a systemic or strategic level has so much going for it. We have remarkable people, like I said earlier, in our government, in private industry, who are talented, hardworking, well-educated, entrepreneurial, critical thinking. We have in our defense establishment, we have remarkable technology, and in our commercial world, we have remarkable world-leading companies and technologies that remain in many cases the envy of the world. For all of our fiscal challenges, we have a significant amount of money. I mean, we're spending $700 billion a year on national defense. We have an economy that's somewhere on the order of $18 trillion. A lot of that is private capital on any given day that's just kind of looking for good things to do to make a positive return on investment. So we have all of these things going for us that I would argue, many of our competitors would gladly trade places with, to get those kinds of advantages. The thing that is so frustrating to me, the note of pessimism that I guess I hit in the book, is that our problem is us. We cannot get out of our own way. We cannot get over our own political dysfunction, the infighting and the gridlock that has just ground us to a halt, that has slowed our ability to actually move into the future with the kind of, urgency and sort of just talent that we can as a country. The good news about that is we control our own destiny. Those are problems that are inherently problems we can solve because they're problems largely of our own making. What I hope is going to happen, the reason I wrote the book, is to try to focus people on the fact that we have a capacity to solve these problems. But we need that sense of urgency. We need that sense of imagination that if we don't act and act now, we are going to fall behind. And we are going to end up in a world that is going to be much worse for the American people than the one we have come to take for granted for a very long period of time. So, I believe it's possible to change in the same way that I believe it's possible to do, 4 flips off a 10-meter platform. Like, it's doable, but it's just really hard. But it is something that we can achieve, but we just have to get out of our own way. We have to stop blocking our own kicks. And my hope is that is it's sort of that level of imagination is something that we're going to change.
Every one of the messages in your book resonated with me, not just in my previous experience, but in fact in my current job at Pratt and Whitney, because every day the company is focused on providing those advanced technologies that maintains our competitive edge against China in advanced propulsion technologies. One of the few areas where we still have that superiority, and it is in fact actually critically important for us to maintain that. So taking full advantage of the thoughts and insights from you in your book, Chris, was really important, I think, certainly to my company, but across all of the defense enterprise. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So gentlemen, thank you so much. Chris, it was a great discussion. General Moeller, as always, great moderation. And thank you to Pratt & Whitney for their support of Global Security Forum as well. Everybody, if you don't have a copy, get the Kill Chain. You only got a taste today. It really is just a transformational book. It will transform how you think about the future of defense and the defense enterprise. For those of you who can join us, I encourage you to join us as we continue Global Security Forum. Tonight, we have our Luminary Award honoring Medal of Honor recipient Paul Buddy Bucca, and we have special guests, General David Petraeus, General Joseph Votel, General Lloyd Austin. We have 3 former CENTCOM commanders, so join us tonight, and then we'll conclude tomorrow with General Wesley Clark in conversation with Art House about how we renew America together. This was a fantastic conversation. Share it with someone you know. Hopefully we'll see you at another GSF session. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike. Have a great day, gentlemen.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, sir. See you.